Good morning, friends. There is a fun kind of foggy effect today with the camera. Very interesting YouTube filter, I guess. Welcome to Geeta. Welcome to Jens, Priyakant, Bradley, Leah, Ella, Tran, Ethan, Michael, Kevin, and Scott. Welcome to everyone. So there is a link on the live chat on the sutta we will be doing this morning, which is Vajrayana 19, that the Dvedhāvitakka Sutta. And good morning to Bhante Sudaso. Thank you for sharing the Dharma once again with us. So I will be passing it off to him so we can start reading, studying.
Great. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So this morning we'll be looking at the Dvedhāvitakka Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 19. So I was just mentioning to Bhante J, I thought it was amusing that he brought the sutta up last night since it was scheduled to go through it this morning, which apparently he didn't know it was on the schedule for this morning. But this is one of those classic suttas which gets referred to very frequently because it does cover some very central and important elements of mind training in Buddhist practice. So as usual, I'll read through the sutta and periodically give some explanations. And then at the end, we'll have some discussion. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove in Anathapindika's park. There the Blessed One addressed the monks. Monks, auspicious sir, those monks replied to the Blessed One. The Blessed One said this: Monks, before my awakening, when I was an unenlightened bodhisattva, this thought occurred to me. What if I were to abide continually dividing my thoughts into two categories? Monks, any thought of sensuality, aversion, or cruelty I put in one category. Any thought of renunciation, non-aversion, and non-cruelty I put in the second category. In other words, he is dividing his thoughts into those that are wholesome and those that are unwholesome. And analyzing them in that way. He says, monks, while I was abiding in this way, vigilant, ardent, and resolute, in other words, he was paying very clear attention to what was going on in his mind. He continues, a sensual thought arose in me. I understand it in this way. A sensual thought has arisen in me. This leads to my own affliction, to the affliction of others, and to the affliction of both. It destroys wisdom, brings irritation, and does not lead to nibbana. So this is the basic reflection on considering what effect unwholesome thoughts have on the mind. So in this case, he's mentioning sensual thought, but he applies the same reasoning to the other two categories, aversive thoughts and cruel thoughts. So reflecting, this harms me. So when we're caught up in sensual thoughts, aversive thoughts, or cruel thoughts, that makes us unhappy, it makes us miserable, and it leads to us doing things that bring harm upon ourselves. It also leads to us doing things that harm others, and naturally then it leads to us doing things that harm both self and others. So we spoke the other day about the Mahadukkha Kanda Sutta, I believe it was, where we spoke about all the horrible consequences of pursuing sensuality. So that gives some pretty clear examples of how getting lost in sensual thoughts leads to us engaging in no end of unwholesome conduct and harmful choices. That leads to us experiencing suffering and torment in a wide variety of ways. And he says it destroys wisdom. So why do sensual thoughts destroy wisdom? Well, they lead to us getting deeper immersed in delusion. So the delusion that happiness can be found through sensual experiences. The delusion of me, of I am getting what I want. I want this, I want that. And the delusion of permanence. So this persisting idea of happily ever after. If I get what I want, then I'll live happily ever after. Well, there is no ever after. Things last for a certain amount of time, and then they end. There is no ever after. So getting lost in sensual thoughts destroys wisdom. It prevents wisdom from arising, and it damages and weakens whatever wisdom we already have. It also is very injurious to samadhi, by the way. So I can think of countless times when I was trying to practice meditation, and sensual thoughts kept appearing in the mind. And if I got involved in those sensual thoughts, then my samadhi disappeared like that. I'd lose my meditation. I'd lose my concentration. I'd lose my focus. Same with aversive thoughts and cruel thoughts. Destroys our samadhi, takes us away from training the mind. And without samadhi, there can be no wisdom. There can be no insight. He says it brings irritation. I find this amusing. So he's also emphasizing that it's actually irritating to ourselves. Sensual thoughts, they actually don't make us happy. They irritate us. It's like rubbing sandpaper on your skin. It's just like, or walking barefoot on gravel. It's just like, ow, ow, ow. Like, why are we doing this? And of course, the same with aversive thoughts and cruel thoughts. They irritate our own mind. It's not pleasant at all. And of course, there's an element of pleasantness to it, or else we wouldn't get wrapped up in it. But it brings irritation. It brings discomfort. And he says, and it does not lead to nibbana. So sensual thoughts do not lead to enlightenment. In fact, they lead away from enlightenment. Aversive thoughts, cruel thoughts, these do not lead to enlightenment. They lead away from enlightenment. They prevent us from awakening. And the Buddha says, monks, by reflecting, it leads to my own affliction, it disappeared. Monks, by reflecting, it leads to the affliction of others, it disappeared. Monks, by reflecting, it leads to the affliction of both, it disappeared. Monks, by reflecting, it destroys wisdom, brings irritation, and does not lead to nibbana, it disappeared. Monks, I abandoned, removed, and destroyed all arisen sensual thoughts. And again, he applies the same thing to aversive thoughts and thoughts of cruelty. So this is the remedy, is whenever a sensual thought, aversive thought, or cruel thought arises in the mind, we look at it and we reflect. This leads to my own affliction. And that might lead to us letting go of those thoughts. As we reflect, I am hurting myself with these thoughts. It leads to the affliction of others. We reflect, I am hurting others with these thoughts. These thoughts lead to me harming others. Or to the affliction of both. If one or the other is not working, well, this leads to the affliction of both self and others. It hurts both me and other people. And you can also reflect, it destroys wisdom, it brings irritation, and it does not lead to enlightenment. So if you're a sincere, committed Buddhist practitioner, then your ultimate goal is to develop world-transcending wisdom and to attain full enlightenment. So then when we realize we're doing something that creates the opposite effect, then we should remind ourselves. It's like, oh, I am going directly contrary to my quest. It's kind of like if you're planting a garden, and instead of sowing seeds, you sow salt. Not only is that not going to be productive, it's actually damaging the soil and making it even harder to grow anything there in the future. So like what farmer goes out in their field and instead of bringing a bag of vegetable seeds, they bring a bag of salt and they start casting salt all over their fields. No one would do that. That's just insane. It's completely counterproductive. Well, that's what we're doing when we sow sensual thoughts, aversive thoughts, and cruel thoughts in our mind. Not only are we stopping our progress towards awakening, we're actually contributing to backsliding. We're making things worse. So that can also be a way of overcoming these unwholesome thoughts, is by reminding ourselves that this does not lead to enlightenment. In fact, it destroys our wisdom and leads away from enlightenment. So this is similar to where the Buddha talks about reflecting on the drawbacks. So the Buddha talks about contemplating gratification, drawback, and escape. So the gratification of sensual thoughts, aversive thoughts, cruel thoughts, acknowledging that there is something kind of appealing there, or else we wouldn't be interested in the first place. But there's also drawbacks. So reflecting, it hurts me, it hurts others, it hurts both me and others. It destroys wisdom, it makes me irritable, and it leads away from enlightenment. So that's reflecting on the drawbacks so that we can let go of these thoughts. We can stop participating in them. And then the Buddha, he makes this statement, which is very commonly quoted because it's actually summing up a very basic principle of Buddhist practice. The Buddha says, "Monks, whatever a monk frequently thinks about and considers becomes the inclination of his mind." In other words, we have the power to shape our own mind. Some people come and they say, "Oh, I just can't help it. My mind just automatically starts thinking about sensuality or thinking about cruelty or thinking aversive thoughts. It just seems to do it on its own." And it's like, well, why do you think that is? Because that's what you've trained it to do. So that's what it does. It's kind of like people who, whenever their cat starts meowing, they give it food. They're like, "Oh, poor kitty, it's hungry, it's asking for food, I'll give it some food." So then the cat thinks, "Oh, if I meow, I get food." So then the cat meows even more. The cat keeps meowing and meows louder. It meows more and more often because it figures out, oh, the human is training me that meowing leads to food. Well, and then people complain. They're like, "Oh, my cat is so noisy and obnoxious all the time. I wonder why that is." It's like, because you trained it to be that way. You taught your cat that being loud is a good thing. You've taught your cat that meowing all the time is a good thing. So it's the same. We keep feeding the negative tendencies of our mind and then wondering why they're so strong. It's like, well, because that's how we've trained our mind to be. We keep rewarding the unwholesome thoughts. No wonder they've become so strong. We keep feeding and building up the unwholesome thoughts. No wonder they're so strong. But we have the ability to do the opposite. We can feed and nourish wholesome thoughts instead. So the Buddha, he continues explaining this. He says, if a monk frequently thinks about and considers sensual thoughts, then thoughts of renunciation are abandoned. Sensual thoughts become frequent, and his mind inclines towards sensual thoughts. Pretty straightforward. If you keep feeding the sensual thoughts, then you won't think about renunciation. You won't think about contentment. It's another way of relating to renunciation. Renunciation can also be interpreted as contentment, being content with the way things are, not seeking something more, not seeking something extra, just being content. So right now I'm just sitting here on a seat, not having any particular sensual experience, and I'm content with this. So that's renunciation. I'm letting go of any wish or desire for something else, something more. And sensual thoughts become frequent and one's mind inclines towards sensual thoughts. Again, the more you do something, the more pervasive it becomes in the mind. The more often and the more strongly it comes up. So some people say, like, "Oh, well, if I just feed it, then it will go away. But that's not how it works. That doesn't solve the problem. I remember during one retreat many, many years ago, I used to be a writer. I used to write fiction and a little bit of poetry. This was a long time ago. I remember during one retreat many, many years ago, I had this story kept coming up in my mind, this storyline, plot line for a novel. And I thought, okay, well, maybe if I just like sit down and write out this story, then I'll stop thinking about it and I can go back to meditating. So I sat down and I started writing the story and laid out all the ideas that I'd had, got it all out on paper. And I went back to meditating, and my mind was even more obsessed with the storyline. Started fleshing out the characters in more detail, started going into more ramifications of the plot lines and different ways the plot could play out from there. And I realized, oh, by sitting down and writing down the ideas I had, not only did that fail at the goal of removing the thoughts from my mind, it actually encouraged those thoughts. It built up that tendency to think about writing stories. It built up that tendency to flood the mind with plot lines and characters and so on. So I tore up I'd written at that point over 100 pages. And at that point, I just tore it up and threw it away. And I was like, that's the end of that. And I haven't written a word since then. I haven't written a single word of a fiction story since then. Because I clearly saw exactly what the Buddha saw here. The more you think about and consider something, the more it fills your mind, the more your mind inclines towards it. So you can't feed your demon to make it go away. If you feed the demon, it just gets bigger and stronger and more persistent. And he says the same. If one thinks about and considers aversive thoughts, then thoughts of non-aversion will not arise. If one thinks thoughts of cruelty, then thoughts of non-cruelty are abandoned and thoughts of cruelty become frequent and so on. And he gives a simile here. He says, monks, it is like the last month of the rainy season at the beginning of autumn, when fields are crowded with crops and a cow herder is herding cows. Using a stick, he fends off, forces back, obstructs, and keeps those cows away from that field of crops. For what reason? Monks, it is because the cow herder sees that it would be a cause of execution, imprisonment, fining, or reprimand. In the same way, monks, I saw the drawback, degradation, and defilement of unwholesome mind states, and the blessing of renunciation and the factor of purification in wholesome mind states. So in other words, when farmers grow crops and they spend all spring and summer working to grow the crops and get everything ready for harvest, and then when it's getting close to harvest, all those crops are almost ready to be taken in. And then a herd of rampaging cows goes through the field and destroys all the crops. Oops. Uh-oh, not so good. Actually, the cow herder who recklessly let his cows destroy another person's crops could get in a lot of trouble for that. He could get in a lot of legal difficulties for that. Not such a good situation. So, or even if it's his own crops, the farmer accidentally lets his cows destroy his own crops through negligence, through not paying enough attention. So it's the same with our own mind. We spend all these years building up wholesome mind states, and then we let some unwholesome thoughts just rampage through our mind and destroy everything. Not so good, is it? We need to be really careful about this. Then the Buddha talks about the opposite perspective. He says, while I was abiding in this way, vigilant, ardent, and resolute, a thought of renunciation arose in me. I understand it in this way. A thought of renunciation has arisen in me. This does not lead to my own affliction, to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both. It nurtures wisdom, it eliminates irritation, and it leads to nibbana. Monks, even if I thought about and considered that thought at night, I saw no danger with that as its cause. Monks, even if I thought about and considered that thought during the day, I saw no danger with that as its cause. Monks, even if I thought about and considered that thought during both night and day, I saw no danger with that as its cause. However, when I thought about and considered for too long, my body became tired. When the body is tired, the mind is disturbed. A disturbed mind is far from concentration. Monks, I internally settled, relaxed, focused, and concentrated my mind. For what reason? May my mind not be disturbed. So here he's showing the reflection on wholesome thoughts, reflecting that wholesome thoughts don't harm anyone. The thoughts of renunciation, of kindness, of compassion, these don't harm anyone. In fact, they bring benefit. They nurture wisdom. They eliminate irritation, and they lead to enlightenment. So this is really important to recognize. There is no harm in wholesome thoughts. There is no harm in thoughts of renunciation, kindness, and compassion. There's no danger here at all. So I recall one person, they came on a retreat with us a few years ago. And on that retreat, I was focusing on going through a number of suttas. And at one point, this person came to me and told me, she was like, I'm really scared. I was like, what are you scared of? And she said, I'm really scared that if I keep thinking about these suttas, that I'm going to lose interest in the things that I like doing. And I might even wind up becoming a monastic. And I was like, and what's the problem here? Is that this doesn't sound like a bad thing to me. And at the end of the retreat, we never saw her again. She left and we never saw her again. So I think she took her own thoughts a little too seriously on this one. So there's no danger in renunciation. Yeah, you might lose interest in sensuality. That's a good thing. It'll make you a lot happier, make your mind a lot more peaceful. It will help you make progress towards enlightenment. And yeah, you might become interested in becoming a monastic. That's great. Monastic life is great for the most part. It has its drawbacks, but it's pretty good. Pretty good. And especially if you're interested in enlightenment, the monastic life is really, really conducive to this. But then the Buddha points out here, he points out that when he spent too much time just focused on investigating the wholesomeness of wholesome mind states, the blessings of wholesome mind states, then he started to get tired. And when he got tired, then he had to switch to doing Samadhi practice. So this is also pointing to the fact that if one tries to do exclusively Vipassana practice, if one tries to do only insight meditation all the time, that's not very effective. You also need to incorporate Samadhi practice, because Samadhi practice refreshes and nourishes the mind. It unifies and stabilizes the mind. It brightens and settles the mind. If we try to just do pure Vipassana practice all the time, for most people, that's not very effective. For most people, it means that they actually get really irritable, or if not irritable, they just don't make much progress. Their insight remains very shallow and ineffective. So I've met a number of people who tried to practice pure Vipassana without Samadhi for years or even decades. Not impressed. Not impressive at all. It really shows that there's something critically lacking in that approach to practice. So the most impressive practitioners I've met were people who had a strong Samadhi practice as well as a strong Vipassana practice. That's what seems to bring the best results and make for the most impressive practitioners. So then the Buddha again comes back to this critical statement. He says, whatever a monk frequently thinks about and considers becomes the inclination of his mind. Monks, if a monk frequently thinks about and considers thoughts of renunciation, then sensual thoughts are abandoned. Thoughts of renunciation become frequent, and his mind inclines towards thoughts of renunciation. And the same with non-aversion and non-cruelty. And he gives a simile. He says, monks, it is like the last month of the hot season, when all the crops have been brought into the villages, and a cow herder is herding cows. While sitting at the root of a tree or in the open air, he only needs to maintain mindfulness that the cows are there. In the same way, monks, there only needed to be mindfulness that mind states are there. In other words, once we train the mind to be entirely fixated on wholesomeness, then we can relax. We don't need to be so obsessively concerned, because we know that whatever is arising in the mind is wholesome. So when we see that what's arising in the mind is all harmless stuff, then a sense of serenity and peacefulness comes over us. So again, in the simile, it's after all the crops have been harvested. So at this point, the fields are empty, and the farmers won't be planting anything in there for months. So nobody minds if your cows go wandering through their fields. In fact, they might be happy about it because cows will fertilize the fields. So they're not going to be the least bit bothered if your cows go wandering through the crop fields, because there aren't any crops to destroy. The cows are only bringing benefit. They're not causing any harm. So the cow herder doesn't need to worry about what the cows are doing. He can just relax. He still pays attention, but he doesn't need to be bothered by what the cows are doing. Doesn't need to forcefully restrain the cows all the time. So it's the same. Once we train our minds to be predominantly wholesome, then we can relax. We don't need to forcefully restrain our mind from unwholesome patterns anymore. We can just let our thoughts be what they are, knowing that they're wholesome and harmless. Then the Buddha goes into describing the practices that he undertook. So he went through this similarly in a recent sutta, so I'm going to breeze through this fairly quickly. He says, monks, unrelenting energy was aroused in me, clear mindfulness was established, the body was unagitated and tranquil, the mind was concentrated and focused. Monks, secluded from sensuality, secluded from unwholesome phenomena, I attained and remained in the first jhana, which has thought and consideration, and has rapture and pleasure produced by seclusion. With the calming of thought and consideration, and with internal composure and mental focus, I attained and remained in the second jhana, which is free of thought and free of consideration, and has rapture and pleasure born from concentration. With the fading away of rapture, I remained equanimous, mindful, and clearly comprehending, and I experienced pleasure with the body. I attained and remained in the third jhana, which the noble ones describe as equanimous, mindful, and dwelling happily. With the abandoning of pleasure, the abandoning of pain, and the prior disappearance of elation and depression, I attained and remained in the fourth jhana, which has neither pain nor pleasure, and has purity due to mindfulness and equanimity. In other words, the Buddha practiced samadhi and developed the four jhanas. So he developed this completely stable, unified, clear, and alert state of mind that we call jhana. And he says, when the mind was concentrated in this way, completely pure, clean, spotless, free of defilement, soft, flexible, stable, and imperturbable, I directed the mind towards recollection of past lives. I recalled many past lives, that is, 1 birth, 2 births, up through 100,000 births, many eons of universal expansion and contraction. He remembered, there, such was my name, such was my clan, my appearance, my food, my experience of pleasure and pain, and the ending of my lifespan. When I fell from there, I rose over there, such was my name, and so on. And when I fell from there, I rose here. In this way, I remember many past lives in every characteristic in detail. Monks, this is the first knowledge which I attained in the first portion of the night. Ignorance was destroyed, knowledge arose. Darkness was destroyed, light arose, as it is for one who dwells vigilant, ardent, and resolute. So the Buddha directed his mind to remembering his past lives. This is what he did during the first part of the night he attained enlightenment. He remembered his own past lives. And he remembered countless eons of past lives in extreme detail. And this was important because this formed the foundation for his understanding of karma and rebirth, which is the second knowledge. So then the second knowledge, he says, when the mind was concentrated in this way, as above, I directed the mind towards knowledge of the death and rebirth of beings. With the divine eye, which is pure and surpasses human vision, I saw beings dying and being reborn, inferior, superior, beautiful, ugly, fortunate, and unfortunate. I understood how beings fare according to their actions. These honorable beings were endowed with bodily misconduct, verbal misconduct, and mental misconduct. They criticized noble ones. They held false perspectives, and they undertook actions based on false perspectives. After dying, when they were separated from their body, they arose in a state of deprivation, a bad destination, downfall, hell. However, these honorable beings were endowed with good bodily conduct, good verbal conduct, and good mental conduct. They did not criticize noble ones, they had correct perspectives, and they undertook actions based on correct perspectives. After dying, when they were separated from their body, they arose in a good destination, a heavenly world. So, in other words, here the Buddha is recognizing how the process of karma and rebirth applies equally to all beings. How all sentient beings are in this constant cycle of making choices and reaping the consequences of those choices. So cause and effect, action and result. And seeing how this operates over the course of many lifetimes. How what we do in one life affects what we experience in future lives. How the conditions into which we are reborn are related to the choices we made in past lives. And more importantly, how the choices we make in this life determine what experiences we'll have in future lives. And then the third knowledge, he says, when the mind was concentrated in this way, completely pure, clean, spotless, free of defilement, soft, flexible, stable, and imperturbable, I directed the mind towards knowledge of the elimination of the taints. So that's the defilements of the mind. So once he understood this, he saw how karma and rebirth operates. He saw how the choices we make determine what we experience. And he saw how all of us are caught in this ongoing cycle of death and rebirth, death and rebirth, death and rebirth. There's also the recognition then there is a way of acting, a way of perceiving, a way of thinking, a way of training the mind, which leads towards eliminating one's defilements and attaining full enlightenment, breaking free of this cycle of dukkha, the cycle of pain and misery. So that's what he directed his mind towards. He directed his mind towards trying to figure out how can we eliminate our defilements and attain freedom from suffering, freedom from the cycle of painful death and rebirth. So he says, I accurately knew this is suffering. I accurately knew this is the source of suffering. I accurately knew this is the cessation of suffering. I accurately knew this is the practice which leads to the cessation of suffering. That's the Four Noble Truths. Again, the Four Noble Truths are the core essence of Buddhist practice. They're the basic summary of Buddhism, which encapsulates everything the Buddha taught. And it encapsulates what enlightenment is. Enlightenment is the direct, clear knowing of the Four Noble Truths. He says, I accurately knew these are the taints. This is the source of the taints. This is the cessation of the taints. This is the practice which leads to the cessation of the taints. So here he's also directly drawing a connection between one's defilements and one's dukkha. So defilements are dukkha. Dukkha is the result of defilement. So to know about one's defilements, to know what causes them, how to make them cease, is to know about dukkha and what causes it and what makes it cease. So the Buddha continues, knowing in this way, seeing in this way, my mind was liberated from the taint of sensuality, from the taint of existence, and from the taint of ignorance. When there was liberation, there was the knowledge liberated. I knew birth has been eliminated, the holy life has been lived, what was to be done has been done, there will be no further existence here. Monks, this is the third knowledge which I attained in the third portion of the night. Ignorance was destroyed, knowledge arose, darkness was destroyed, light arose, as it is for one who dwells vigilant, ardent, and resolute. So here he's emphasizing once again that directly knowing the Four Noble Truths is what led to his enlightenment, is what triggered his full enlightenment. Then he gives a simile to end the sutta. He says, monks, it is like a pond in a large valley in the forest, which a large community of deer live in dependence on. Some man might arise who desires their detriment, harm, and entrapment. He might close the safe, secure path that leads to bliss, open a false path, put in a decoy, and set up a distraction. In this way, monks, at a later occasion, that large community of deer might attain misfortune and disaster. However, monks, another might arise who desires their benefit, welfare, and security. He might open the safe, secure path that leads to bliss, close the false path, take away the decoy, and remove the distraction. In this way, monks, at a later occasion, that large community of deer might attain prosperity, growth, and abundance. Monks, I have made this simile to demonstrate a meaning. And this is the meaning in this case. Monks, a pond in a large valley in the forest is a designation for sensuality. Monks, a large community of deer is a designation for beings. Monks, a person who desires their detriment, harm, and entrapment is a designation for Mara, the evil one. So Mara is the tempter, the trickster, the deva who comes and tries to tempt us to stray away from the path of Buddhist practice and indulge in sensuality and aversion and defilements. Mara is also sometimes used as a metaphor for our own defilements, for our own delusions. Says monks, false path is a designation for the eightfold wrong path. That is, wrong view, wrong thought, wrong speech, wrong action, wrong livelihood, wrong effort, wrong mindfulness, and wrong concentration. So I could actually talk for an hour just on the subject of the wrong eightfold path, the eightfold wrong path. But basically, it's just the opposite of the Noble Eightfold Path, the right path. And he says, monks, decoy is a designation for delight and passion. Distraction is a designation for ignorance. So basically, distracted by delight and passion and by ignorance and obsessed with sensuality, then we wind up engaging in the eightfold wrong path, these 8 wrong forms of conduct that just lead to our harm and suffering and keep us trapped in the cycle of birth and death. And he says, monks, a person who desires their benefit, welfare, and security is a designation for the Tathagata, the Arhat, the fully enlightened one. Safe, secure path that leads to bliss is a designation for the Noble Eightfold Path. That is, right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So I find this cute here also, that he's portraying Mara as being the deer hunter who's trying to trap the deer. And the Buddha is the person who's like undermining the deer hunter, trying to save the deer so they don't get taken down by the deer hunter. And the Buddha says, monks, I have opened the safe, secure path that leads to bliss, closed the false path, taken away the decoy, and removed the distraction. Monks, what is to be done out of compassion by a teacher who seeks the welfare of his disciples has been done by me for you. Monks, there are these tree roots, there are these empty buildings. Meditate, monks, do not be negligent. Do not be one who later falls into regret. This is my instruction for you. This is what the Blessed One said. Satisfied, those monks delighted in the Blessed One's speech.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
So that's the end of the sutta. So at this time, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the live chat and I'll answer them as best I can.
Thank you so much, Bhante. That was great. Kevin says about the wrong path, eightfold path. No need. I'm an expert on the eightfold wrong path already.
We all have lots of experience in that one.
Yeah, we've all got degrees on that, PhDs. And Bradley says Dhammasukha. Yeah, lots of Dhammasukha. This is one of my favorite suttas, as we always say at the end of every sutta. And Ethan says, there's a sutta that says, bhikkhus, there are these three kinds of unwholesome thoughts. What three? A thought concerned with not being despised, a thought concerned with gain, honor, and fame, a thought concerned with involvement in the affairs of others. And Ethan asks, any ideas of antidotes to these thoughts aside from mindfulness, like how metta is an antidote for aversion?
Can you tell the three kinds again, one at a time? What's the first one?
A thought concerned with not being despised.
Well, actually, that's a great one. So first off, recognize that no matter what you do, somebody does not like it. You can do the most wholesome, compassionate, wise things imaginable, and somebody will criticize you for it. Trust me, I know. I've been a monk for a long time, so I know that whether I do the right thing or the wrong thing, people criticize me. This is inevitable. And in fact, the more you move into the public view, the more you will be criticized. The more people will despise you, the more people will object to what you say and do. So that's simply a natural side effect of other people knowing about your existence, is that some of them will despise you. And recognize also that if you are doing what is wholesome and in line with Dhamma, if somebody else despises you, it is because of their own defilements and delusions. It has nothing to do with you, because you know that you are doing what is wholesome and what is right. So you constantly remember that. Constantly remember that you are doing your best to live in accordance with Dhamma, that you are doing what is right, what is wholesome, what is admirable. And if others despise you, it is their own defilement and delusion. It has nothing to do with you. What's the second one?
A thought concerned with gain, honor, and fame.
Yeah, so the remedy there is the thought of renunciation. You can also reflect on the drawbacks of gain, honor, and fame. The more we acquire, the more defensive we become towards what we have. The more obsessed we become with wealth and possessions, the more stingy we tend to be. Similarly, honor and fame. The Buddha says gain, honor, and fame are dreadful. He said these are terrible. He said, do not wish these on anyone. So it's recognizing these things harm us. They puff up our ego. They build up our conceit. They lead to us getting obsessed with things that are not for our benefit. They draw us away from the path. What's the third one?
A thought concerned with involvement in the affairs of others.
Yeah, you recognize that other people, their business is their own. It's not yours. If somebody comes to you and directly asks you to help with their issues, then if you believe you can be of benefit, then it's appropriate to find out what's going on and see what you can do to help if you want to. But otherwise, other people's business is their own. It has nothing to do with you. So you don't get tangled up in it. Again, if you have the opportunity to help others, that's fine. But otherwise, you let other people live their own lives, make their own choices. So if other people want to engage in gossiping and backbiting and nastiness, well, that's their choice. It's sad, but it doesn't have anything to do with you. Unless somebody comes to you and says, I want to learn how to stop this. I want to learn how to get free of these negative cycles. Then you might have a chance to help out. But otherwise, just recognize that getting wrapped up in other people's affairs doesn't do you any good. It doesn't do them any good. It just gets everybody mired deeper and deeper into dukkha. Okay.
All right. There are no questions so far, but there are some comments. Michael shares, parenthetically, Perhaps I'm always happy to see the phrase, the thought came up, because it reminds that these thoughts are not me, not mine. As opposed to, for example, I had this thought. And Scott says, I really enjoyed this morning's discussion. I'm always intrigued by the fact that each time I hear the same sutta, I get something new out of it. A deeper understanding or a new way to relate to the teaching based on recent experiences, etc. All causes and conditions, I suppose. Edward says, I agree, and it's mostly a loved one hating.
Yeah, and that makes it a bit more challenging because that means that we have some kind of emotional attachment involved, which makes it hard for us to be objective. And it also makes it harder for us to pull back. But in those situations, that's still what we have to do. We have to recognize this person is just acting for their own harm, acting based on their own defilements and delusions in a way which is just making them uncomfortable and unhappy. And if I get wrapped up in it, that won't do me any good. It will just get me mired in the same cycle of dukkha. And it can be challenging because sometimes we actually do have to distance ourselves a bit from our loved ones. Sometimes that's the only reasonable option. Just the way it is.
Bradley says, I find the sutta pretty straightforward to understand, but of course the practice of its contents is more difficult.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that's the truth.
All the monastics here are all nodding, like, yep, that's about right.
Yeah, I mean, the Buddha's teachings, for the most part, are quite clear and direct, but so difficult. So difficult. But you just keep doing it. The Buddha says, like, this is why I brought up the Kamada Sutta the other day. The Buddha says, they do even what is hard to do. Because realistically, what other choice do we have? The only other choice is to just keep spinning for eons on the cycle of birth and death. Keep spinning for eons through one form of dukkha after another. That doesn't do us any good. So we might as well try to do what's difficult to do. Because this has the potential to bring a permanent solution to the problem.
Bradley says, how many times have I read, meditate monks, do not be negligent, do not be one who later falls into regret. And yet I decided to sleep in this morning, then meditate.
Yeah, I have the same
I've fallen
thing.
into regret.
When I see that line, I'm just like, oopsie, guilty as charged.
So no sutta.
Yeah.
Find your feet.
Yeah. But then we can forgive ourselves and reestablish ourselves in Dhamma practice. It's all part of the path.
And that's actually one of the comforting things in Buddhism. In Buddhism, we get infinite retries. It's kind of like, like in video games, when you would die and you just start over at the beginning of the level and try again. And you screw up and you die and you start over at the beginning of the level and try again. And you can do it as many times as you need to until eventually you finish the level. That's what it's like.
Now we're all depressed.
A lot of times, let me tell you that. And actually, the really disappointing thing is reflecting how many times we were this close to the end of the level and then we screwed up. This is something I think upon every now and then when I start to get lazy in my practice, is I think, how many times have I been this close to stream entry and then I screwed up? And the answer is countless times. Countless times we've been this close to stream entry and then we screwed up. Ouch. Let's try to do better this time.
And Kevin asks, quote, there are these empty buildings, end of quote. Any specific reference here?
Yeah, so this is referring to going to meditate in quiet, peaceful places where there's not other people to distract you, but also not a lot of random possessions and things to distract you either. So an empty building, like a building which is not full of people or possessions. Okay.
Bradley says, I've thrown controllers as a child when I died super close to the end of a level.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, keeping calm and diligent was what eventually allowed me to succeed.
Yeah,
Right?
totally. And also learning from our mistakes. It's like, okay, well, why? Why did I not finish the level that time? It's like, oh, because I made a mistake at that point in that way. So next time I won't make the same mistake. So we learn from our mistakes and we try again. And eventually we get it. And sometimes we have to ask for help. So I remember I used to go online to, you probably know this reference, GameFAQs.com. So it's this vast repository of help files for like virtually any game imaginable. You could look it up. You could be like, okay, Super Mario Brothers 3, level number 12. How do you get past da-da-da-da-da? And there will be a description of exactly what you need to do in order to get past that obstacle. Well, it's the same in Buddhist practice. We're like, crap, wow, I screwed up on this and I don't know what to do. So then you go to the senior monastics and you say, Bhante, I keep screwing up at this particular spot. What do I do? And you listen to their advice and you see if there's something helpful there.
Monks, the first squatters, so punk. Then he's like, gamers, not so punk. Disclaimer, I'm not a gamer personally. No history of that. And Suzanne says, I keep focusing on me. However, I keep getting pulled.
Yeah, so that's why it's a practice. We recognize that we're going to make mistakes over and over and over again. And making mistakes is not the problem. As long as we learn from our mistakes, we'll keep moving forward. Making mistakes is only a problem if we don't learn from them. Making mistakes is only a problem if we keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again without recognizing them. But if we make mistakes and we try to learn from them, then even if we make the same mistake again, as long as we recognize the mistake again and commit to learning from it and commit to trying to do better, then eventually we will. So that's one thing. Forgive yourself in advance for all the mistakes you're going to make, because there's going to be a lot. So just accept that ahead of time. I am going to make a lot of mistakes. I forgive myself in advance for all the mistakes I'm going to make. Okay?
All right, and I think that's all for this morning. Thank you so much, Bhante, for sharing the Dhamma. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And thank you all for practicing so diligently. We will be meeting again this evening for what's the talk again this evening?
Noble Eightfold Path.
Oh, the Noble Eightfold.
Right speech. Right
Yes,
speech. Yeah.
Correct. Okay, that's great. Yeah, so we will be discussing right speech this evening, and then tomorrow we will be having, I think, chanting and meditation, right? Tomorrow morning? It's Monday.
Yes, I think so.
All right, great. So hope to see you all soon, and thank you so much again for practicing together with us this morning. Have a great.
The way